I was transferred to Sector 7 in the second week of November. The paperwork came through on a Wednesday, which I remember because I'd just submitted a leave request for the following month. And when I saw the transfer notice in my inbox, I understood that the leave request would not be approved. You don't get transferred to a new sector and then immediately take time off. That's not how it works. So I withdrew the request before anyone had to reject it, which is a small thing, but it's the kind of small thing that tells you something about how I operated back then. I anticipated what was expected of me, and I did it before I was asked. I was good at that. I was proud of it even. The transfer was presented as an opportunity. My division chief, a woman named Hargrove, called me into her office and explained that Sector 7 was a long-term environmental monitoring post in a remote forested area in the northern part of the state. She said the previous ranger had completed his rotation and that I'd been recommended based on my record. She said the posting was 8 months, solo, with bi-weekly supply drops and daily radio check-ins. She said the duties were straightforward: perimeter patrols, weather logging, wildlife documentation, soil and water sampling at designated points. She said I'd be given a full briefing before deployment. I asked what was being monitored specifically, and she said it was a multi-agency environmental study focused on long-term ecological patterns. She said my role was data collection, not analysis, and that I wouldn't need to understand the full scope of the project to do my job effectively. This was said without condescension. It was said the way you'd explain a division of labor to someone who understood divisions of labor. I nodded. The briefing happened 2 days later in a conference room at the regional office. It was just me and a man named Ellison, who was introduced as my sector supervisor. He was maybe mid-50s, lean, gray at the temples, with the kind of posture that suggested either military service or chronic back problems. He spoke slowly and precisely, with long pauses between sentences, as if he were choosing each word from a very large and carefully organized vocabulary. I liked him initially. He seemed competent and unhurried, which are two qualities I associate with people who know what they're doing. He went through the operational manual with me, page by page. Radio protocols, reporting formats, equipment inventory, patrol schedules, emergency procedures. Most of it was standard, identical, or nearly identical to what I'd used at my previous posting. The manual was in a blue 3-ring binder, maybe 1.5 inches thick, and by the time we finished, I'd been sitting in that conference room for almost 4 hours, and my lower back was stiff and my coffee was cold. At the end, Ellison closed the binder and folded his hands on the table and looked at me for a moment without speaking. Then he said something that I've replayed in my memory many times since, and I want to get the wording as close to exact as I can. He said, "You're going to be out there alone for a long time. The forest is large and it's quiet, and your mind is going to do things with that quiet. You're going to notice things that don't quite line up, things that seem a little off. Maybe something looks different than it did the day before, or you hear something you can't place, or you find something where it shouldn't be. When that happens, and it will happen, I want you to set it aside. Don't dwell on it. Don't try to figure it out. And don't put it in your reports. Your reports should reflect your duties and your data. That's it. If something doesn't fit the reporting categories, it doesn't go in the report." I waited for him to explain further. He didn't. He just sat there with his hands folded, looking at me with an expression that was patient but not inviting. It was the expression of someone who had said what he intended to say and was now waiting for me to accept it. I said, "So, standard isolation protocol. Don't chase your own tail." He smiled slightly. "Exactly," he said. "Don't chase your own tail." We shook hands and I left. Driving home that evening, I thought about what he'd said, and it made sense to me. I'd done remote postings before, not as remote as this one, but remote enough to know that isolation plays tricks. You start seeing patterns that aren't there. You start assigning meaning to random events. A branch falls and you think it fell deliberately. A bird call sounds like a word. The solution, which any experienced ranger knows, is to stay disciplined. Stick to your tasks. Trust the routine. Don't let the quiet turn you into someone who sees things. I thought Ellison was giving me good advice. I thought he was being responsible. I arrived at the sector station on a Monday. The drive-in took almost 3 hours from the nearest town, the last 45 minutes on an unpaved forest road that wound through increasingly dense timber before ending at a small gravel clearing. The station was a single-story cabin, solidly built, with a metal roof, a covered porch, and a shortwave radio antenna on a mast bolted to the north side. Behind it was a storage shed and a small weather monitoring setup. Thermometer, barometer, rain gauge, anemometer, all connected to a manual data logger. There was a propane tank for the stove and heater, a rainwater collection system, and a composting head around back. The cabin itself was clean and spare. A desk, a cot, a wood stove, metal shelving with supplies, a small kitchen area with a 2-burner propane stove and a basin sink. No electricity beyond what the generator provided, which I was instructed to run no more than 4 hours a day to conserve fuel. I spent the first day inventorying equipment and familiarizing myself with the station. Everything matched the manual. The radio worked. The generator started without trouble. The supplies were adequate and organized. There was a laminated trail map pinned to the wall above the desk, showing the patrol routes, color-coded by day of the week, with GPS coordinates for all sampling points. It was thorough. It was professional. It left nothing to interpretation, which I appreciated. That first night I sat on the porch and drank instant coffee from a tin mug and listened. The forest was dense Douglas fir and western hemlock, with a thick understory of fern and salal and Oregon grape. The canopy was high and closed, blocking most of the sky. In the clearing around the station, I could see a rough circle of stars overhead. But at the tree line, the darkness was total. Not the darkness of a room with the lights off, but the darkness of a space that continues beyond what you can perceive, that has depth and dimension and simply refuses to reveal it. The sounds were what you'd expect. Wind in the canopy, the tick and settle of cooling wood, an owl, distant. The faint ongoing drip of moisture moving through the understory. Condensation falling leaf to leaf in a chain that never quite reached the ground before starting over. I want to describe this in detail because the sound of that forest became the medium I lived in for the next several months. It wasn't background noise. It was the substance of my environment, the way water is the substance of a fish's environment. I moved through it, I breathed it, I slept inside it, and over time, I became acutely sensitive to its texture, its rhythm, its tiny variations. I could tell time by the way the bird sounds layered in the morning. I could estimate wind speed by the pitch of the canopy noise. I could sense rain coming by a subtle shift in the quality of the dripping, a quickening, a thickening, as if the forest were bracing itself. This is what people don't understand about remote postings. The silence isn't empty. It's full. It's so full that after a while you start to feel like you're not listening to the forest, but the forest is listening to you. And you become very conscious of every sound you make, every footstep, every breath, every rustle of your jacket, because each one feels like an interruption, like you're the intruder, like you're the thing that doesn't belong. The first 3 weeks were uneventful. I followed the patrol schedule precisely, rotating through the 5 designated routes on a weekly cycle, each one covering a different section of the sector. The terrain was varied: ridgeline, valley, creek bed, old growth, second growth. Some routes took 3 hours, some took 5. I carried a day pack with water, food, first aid, a compass, my GPS unit, collection vials for water and soil samples, and a field notebook for wildlife observations. I wore the same thing every day: boots, canvas pants, a base layer, a flannel, a rain shell. It rained more often than it didn't. My reports were submitted daily via radio at 1700 hours. The format was standardized: weather data, patrol route completed, any wildlife observations, sample collection notes, equipment status, and a general status line at the end where I wrote Sector 7, no incidents, operational. The person on the other end of the radio was a dispatcher whose call sign was Central. I never learned his real name. He acknowledged my reports with a brief "Copy, Sector 7," and that was the extent of most exchanges. Occasionally he asked a follow-up question about a data point, some weather reading or animal sighting, and I'd clarify, and he'd say, "Copy again," and we'd sign off. The conversations rarely lasted more than 3 minutes. I settled into the rhythm of it quickly. I'm the kind of person who functions well inside structure. Give me a schedule and a set of tasks, and I'll execute them with precision, day after day, without complaint. I've been told this makes me well suited for remote work, and I think that's true, but I've also come to wonder whether it makes me well suited for something else, for compliance, for systems that rely on a person not asking too many questions. I used to think these were the same quality. Now I'm not sure. Day 23 is when I noticed the first thing. I was on the Eastern Ridge Patrol, a route that followed a faint game trail along a ridgeline for about 2 miles before dropping down to a creek crossing and looping back. Near the highest point of the ridge, there was a large western red cedar that I used as a landmark because it had a distinctive shape, a double trunk that split about 15 feet up, and then curved back toward each other without quite meeting, forming an arch you could see from a distance. I'd passed it on every Eastern patrol since I arrived, 6 or 7 times by that point. On day 23, the tree was different. The split was still there, the double trunk, the arch. But there was a mark on the bark at about chest height on the right-hand trunk, a blaze, a horizontal cut, maybe 8 inches long, with the bark stripped cleanly away to reveal the pale wood beneath. It was the kind of mark a person makes with a hatchet to indicate a trail or a boundary. It was fresh. The exposed wood was still light-colored, not yet darkened by exposure. I stood and looked at it. I touched it. The wood was smooth, cut clean, not torn or splintered. It was definitely a human mark. Someone had stood here, recently, and struck this tree with a bladed tool. I was the only person in the sector. There were no authorized visitors, no researchers, no other personnel. The sector boundary was fenced and gated, and the access road was the only way in or out. I'd locked the gate behind me when I arrived. It was still locked. I checked it every resupply day when I drove down to collect the supply drop. I thought about Ellison's instruction. Don't dwell on it. Don't try to figure it out. Don't put it in your report. Was this the kind of thing he meant? A blaze on a tree? It wasn't a weather reading. It wasn't a wildlife observation. It didn't fit any reporting category. But it was also a concrete physical observation. A mark made by a tool in a place where no one should have been. That seemed like something worth reporting regardless of category. But the instruction had been clear, and it had been delivered with the quiet authority of someone who had supervised this sector before me and knew what the posting was like. Maybe previous rangers had found old blazes too. Maybe there were remnants of historical survey work in the forest. Marks that had been made decades ago and only became visible when bark growth patterns shifted. The wood had looked fresh, but I wasn't an arborist. Maybe I was wrong about the age. I didn't report it. I continued the patrol, collected my samples, returned to the station, and submitted my evening report as usual. Sector 7, no incidents, operational. I wrote it the same way I always did, but that night, lying on the cot, I thought about the blaze, and I thought about my own decision not to mention it. And I felt a small, unfamiliar unease that was not quite worry and not quite guilt, but something adjacent to both. Something like the feeling of having left a door unlocked, of knowing that everything is probably fine, but being unable to verify it without getting up, and choosing to stay in bed, and lying there in the dark with the door unlocked in your mind. I let it go. Over the next 2 weeks, I found 3 more blazes. Each one was on a different tree, along a different patrol route, at roughly chest height, horizontal, clean, fresh-looking. I examined each one carefully. I looked for footprints or other signs of human presence nearby. I never found any. The forest floor was too soft, too covered in duff and fern to hold prints well. But there should have been something. A broken fern frond, a scuff in the moss, a boot impression in the mud near a creek crossing. There was nothing. Just the mark on the tree, precise and unexplained. I didn't report any of them. On day 37, I found something else. I was on the Southern Loop Patrol, a route that passed through a stand of old-growth hemlock in a shallow valley. The trees there were enormous, some of them 6 or 7 feet in diameter, their trunks furred with moss and their crowns lost in the canopy darkness. It was the quietest part of the sector. Sound behaved differently in old growth. The massive trunks absorbed and redirected it in ways that made distance hard to judge. A branch falling 100 yards away could sound like it was right behind you, and a creek 10 feet to your left could sound like it was a quarter mile off. In a gap between 2 of the largest hemlocks, I found a cairn, 3 stones, stacked. The bottom stone was flat and roughly oval, about the size of a dinner plate. The middle stone was rounder, fist-sized. The top stone was small and angular, balanced carefully. The stones were dry on top and damp underneath where they contacted each other, which meant they'd been stacked recently, after the last rain, which had been 2 days prior. Someone had been here within the last 48 hours. I circled the cairn slowly, examining the ground. Nothing. No prints, no disturbance, no trail. I looked up, which was an odd instinct, and saw only canopy, layers and layers of green and gray, impenetrable. I did not touch the cairn. I did not report it. That evening, during my radio check-in, Central asked me a question that he hadn't asked before. He said, "Sector 7, any changes to the environment worth noting?" I paused. The question was unusual. My reports followed a fixed format, and changes to the environment wasn't one of the categories. I said no, he said copy, and we signed off. I sat at the desk for a long time after that, turning my pencil end over end between my fingers, thinking. The question could have been routine. Maybe Central asked it periodically. Maybe it was in a rotation I hadn't encountered yet. Or maybe it was specific. Maybe someone had told him to ask. Maybe someone wanted to know if I'd noticed the blazes, the cairn, and was testing whether I'd mentioned them. And if I mentioned them, what then? Would I be told it was nothing, part of the study, remnants of past work? Or would I be told that I'd failed to follow the instruction, that I'd chased my own tail, that I was letting the isolation get to me? I didn't know. And because I didn't know, I did nothing, which was, I realized, exactly what the instruction was designed to produce. It didn't matter whether I was confused or frightened or curious. The instruction covered all of those states. Whatever I felt, whatever I noticed, the response was the same. Set it aside. Don't dwell. Don't report. Continue. The genius of it, if that's the right word, was that it made inaction feel like discipline. It made silence feel professional. It took my strongest quality, my ability to follow procedure, to stay inside the lines, and turned it into a mechanism for not seeing what was in front of me. But I want to be fair to myself. I want to explain why I kept following the instruction even as the things I was noticing became harder to dismiss. It wasn't cowardice. It wasn't stupidity. It was that I didn't have an alternative framework. The instruction was the only guidance I'd been given for dealing with anomalies, and without it, I had nothing. If I decided to start reporting the blazes in the cairns, what would I say? I found marks on trees? I found stacked rocks? These were things that could be explained a dozen ways, and each explanation was more plausible than the one I was avoiding, which was that something was happening in my sector that I wasn't supposed to know about. That explanation felt paranoid. It felt like exactly the kind of thinking Ellison had warned me against. And so I kept returning to the instruction not because I trusted it, but because I trusted my own judgment less. And the instruction was at least stable, at least consistent, at least something to hold on to in an environment where everything else was beginning to feel uncertain. Day 41. I was in the north section, a dense second-growth area where the trees were tightly packed and the undergrowth was almost impenetrable in places. I pushed through a thicket of salal and came out into a small natural opening, maybe 30 feet across, where a large tree had fallen years ago, and the canopy gap had let in enough light for a carpet of moss and young ferns to establish. It was a beautiful spot. Dappled light, soft ground, the kind of clearing where you'd want to sit and eat lunch. There was a folding chair in the center of it. A metal folding chair, the kind you'd find in a church basement or a school cafeteria. Gray with rubber caps on the feet. It was open, set up, facing roughly north. There was nothing else. No table, no equipment, no bag, no sign of who had brought it or why. The moss around the chair's feet was compressed but not torn, as if the chair had been placed there gently. I stood at the edge of the clearing and looked at it for a long time. A chair in the woods, a folding chair, unfolded, positioned, waiting. For what? I didn't enter the clearing. I didn't examine the chair. I turned around and walked back the way I'd come, and I finished the patrol, and I returned to the station, and I sat on my porch with my tin mug, and I looked at the tree line, and I thought about the chair, and I told myself it was debris. Someone had left it. Hikers maybe, from before the sector was restricted. Or a researcher from the study, taking a break, forgetting their chair. These things happen. People leave things in the woods all the time. But the chair was clean. It wasn't weathered or rusted. The rubber caps on the feet were intact, not cracked or perished, and it was open. unfolded and set up, facing north, as if someone had placed it there this morning and intended to come back. I didn't report it. Week 7. The hum started. I don't know how else to describe it. It was a low, continuous sound, right at the edge of perception, the kind of sound you're never quite sure you're hearing. It was there when I woke up in the morning, and there when I went to bed at night. It didn't fluctuate, it didn't pulse. It was just a presence, a tonal floor beneath all other sounds, like the lowest note of an organ held indefinitely. At first, I thought it was the generator. I turned the generator off and listened. The hum continued. I checked the radio equipment, turned it off. Still there. I went outside and stood in the clearing and turned slowly, trying to determine a direction. I couldn't. It seemed to come from everywhere, or from nowhere, or from inside my own head, which was the explanation I eventually settled on. Tinnitus. Mild, persistent, probably caused by the consistent low-frequency sound environment of the forest itself. My ears were adjusting. The hum was an artifact of that adjustment, except that it wasn't constant. I realized this on the 3rd day. It was louder in certain parts of the sector, and quieter in others. On the southern loop, near the old-growth hemlock stand, it was pronounced enough that I could feel it in my chest, a faint vibration, almost sub-audible. On the northern routes, it was barely there. At the station, it was moderate. This didn't fit tinnitus. Tinnitus doesn't have geography. I mentioned it to Central during a check-in, carefully. I said I'd noticed a low-frequency ambient sound that varied by location and asked if there was any known source, a transformer, a pump station, anything in the area that might produce it. There was a pause, longer than usual, and then Central said, "Negative Sector 7. There are no installations in your area, probably atmospheric. Some valleys channel wind in ways that produce low-frequency resonance." Another pause. "Anything else?" I said no. He said, "Copy. Stay on task, Sector 7. Stay on task, not stay on protocol or continue as normal. Stay on task." It was a subtle difference, but I felt it. There was something directive in it, something that said, you are doing a job, and the job is the only thing that matters, and whatever is happening outside the boundaries of the job is not your concern. I stayed on task. The cairn was gone the next time I passed through the old-growth stand. The spot where it had been was bare, no stones, no indentation in the moss, no sign it had ever been there. I stood and looked at the empty space, and felt a disorientation that was almost physical, a lurch, as if the ground had shifted slightly beneath my feet. I was certain of where the cairn had been. I remembered the 2 hemlocks on either side, the angle of the light, the specific patch of moss. This was the spot, and the cairn was gone, removed by someone, while I was elsewhere, in a sector where I was the only person. I went to the eastern ridge on my next patrol of that route, and looked for the blaze on the cedar with the double trunk. It was there, but it was different. The original mark had been horizontal. This one was vertical. Same height, same width, same clean cut, but rotated 90 degrees. I was certain it had been horizontal before. I was absolutely certain. But certainty is a feeling, not a fact. And feelings are not reliable in isolation. And I knew this because Ellison had told me, and because my training had told me, and because every rational part of my mind was telling me that human memory is fallible, that I'd seen the blaze weeks ago and probably misremembered its orientation, and that the simplest explanation was almost always the correct one. I stood there and looked at the vertical blaze and tried to feel certain that it had been horizontal, and I couldn't. The certainty was there a moment ago, and now it was gone, dissolved by the acid of reasonable doubt, and in its place was something worse than uncertainty. It was the awareness that I could no longer trust my own memory, that the instrument I relied on to navigate reality had been compromised, and that I didn't know when the compromise had started or how deep it went. I returned to the station and sat at the desk and opened my field notebook to the page where I'd written my notes from the first time I'd seen the blaze. I'd written, Day 23, Eastern Ridge, Cedar Landmark, fresh blaze, approximately 8 inches. That was all. I hadn't noted whether it was horizontal or vertical. I hadn't thought it was important enough to specify. And now I needed that detail, and it wasn't there. And its absence felt like a hole in the floor of a house I'd been living in. A hole that had always been there but that I'd never noticed because I'd never stepped in that exact spot before. I started being more detailed in my field notes after that, not in my official reports, which continued to follow the standard format and continued to end with no incidents operational. But in the notebook I carried on patrols, I began recording everything. Every blaze, its exact position, orientation, and dimensions. The presence or absence of cairns, the location of the chair, if I could find it, the intensity of the hum at different points. I drew small maps. I noted times. I was meticulous, almost compulsive, because the notebook was the only record I trusted, the only version of events that wasn't filtered through the reporting restrictions, or the fog of my own increasingly unreliable memory. The chair moved. Over the course of 3 weeks, from day 41 to day 62, I found the folding chair in 4 different locations. The first time, it was in the clearing in the north section. The second time, it was beside the creek on the southern loop, set up on a flat rock, facing east. The third time, it was on the ridge trail, tucked against a tree trunk, facing the double-trunk cedar. The fourth time, it was in the old-growth stand, in the exact spot where the cairn had been, facing south. Each time, it was the same chair, same model, same color, same rubber caps. Each time it was clean, dry, positioned deliberately. Each time there was no sign of how it had gotten there, no drag marks, no footprints, no broken vegetation. I sat in it once. The third time, on the ridge, I'd been walking for hours and my legs were tired and the chair was right there. And some part of me thought, this is ridiculous. It's a chair, I'll sit in it, and then the mystery will be reduced. The object will become ordinary. It'll just be a thing I sat in. So I sat down. The metal was cold through my pants. The chair was stable, well balanced. I sat and looked at the forest and listened to the hum, which was moderate here, and I felt nothing unusual. No revelation, no horror, just tiredness and damp clothes and the sound of wind in hemlock. After a few minutes, I stood up and continued the patrol. But that night, I lay on the cot and thought about the chair and realized that sitting in it had not made it ordinary. It had made it worse. Because now I was part of it, whatever it was. I had accepted the chair's presence. I had used it. I had, in some small way, participated. Around week 9, I started having trouble with my sense of time, not clock time, which I monitored obsessively with my watch, but experiential time, the felt duration of events. An hour on patrol would feel like 3 hours. An evening at the station would feel like 15 minutes. I'd look at my watch and find that it was much later or much earlier than I expected. The discrepancies weren't consistent. There was no pattern I could identify. It was as if time itself had become unreliable, or my perception of it had, which amounted to the same thing. I started narrating my actions aloud, not because I was losing touch with reality, but because hearing my own voice helped anchor me. I'm walking the south loop. It's 13:20. The hum is moderate. I'm passing the third hemlock, the one with the shelf fungus. Small, precise, verifiable statements. A chain of facts I could hold on to, but sometimes I would stop mid-sentence and realize I didn't remember starting the sentence, or I would hear myself say something I hadn't intended to say, a word or phrase that seemed to come from somewhere else. And I would stop and stand very still and wait for the feeling to pass. It always passed. That's important. I want to be clear that I never fully lost my grip. I was always at some level functional. I completed every patrol, I collected every sample, I submitted every report on time. From the outside, from Central's perspective, I was performing exactly as expected. My data was clean. My reports were consistent. I was a model ranger. Inside, I was coming apart in ways I couldn't document because the documentation system was designed not to accommodate them. Day 70, I found a second chair. It was on the southern loop, about 20 yards from the creek crossing, set up next to the first chair, which I hadn't seen in over a week, but which was now here, both of them facing the creek, side by side, as if 2 people had placed them there to sit and watch the water together. The chairs were identical, same model, same color. They were spaced about 3 feet apart, angled slightly toward each other, the way chairs are angled in a conversation. I stood and looked at them and felt something I can only describe as a kind of vertigo that had nothing to do with height. It was the vertigo of implication. 2 chairs meant 2 people. Two people meant company, intention, a social arrangement. One chair could be debris, forgotten equipment, an anomaly. Two chairs was a plan. I did not sit in either of them. I backed away from the creek crossing and took a different route to the sampling point, and finished the patrol and went home and submitted my report and wrote, "No incidents operational," and lay on my cot and stared at the ceiling of the cabin, which was made of tongue and groove pine boards that I had memorized by this point, every knot and grain line, and I listened to the hum, which was louder now, or I was more sensitive to it, and I tried to think clearly about what was happening. Here is what I came up with. Either someone was in the sector with me, or I was placing these objects myself during the time gaps I couldn't account for. Neither explanation was acceptable. The first meant the sector was compromised, and I was being kept ignorant of it. The second meant I was losing my mind. And the instruction, Ellison's instruction, covered both scenarios perfectly. Don't dwell on it. Don't try to figure it out. Don't report it. Whether the anomalies were real or imagined, the response was the same. Ignore them. The instruction was diagnosis proof. It worked no matter what was wrong. I began to wonder whether that was its purpose. Week 11. Central asked me again if I'd noticed any changes to the environment. I said no. He said, "Nothing at all?" I said no, nothing. There was a pause that lasted 5 or 6 seconds, which is a very long time on a radio. And then he said, "Copy, Sector 7. Good work." Good work for noticing nothing, for having nothing to report, for being, as far as the official record was concerned, a person to whom nothing unusual was happening. I thanked him and signed off, and then I sat at the desk and put my head in my hands and stayed like that for a while. The field notebook was getting full. I'd been writing in it compulsively, recording every detail I could, and the pages were dense with small, tight handwriting, measurements, locations, times, descriptions. I read back through it sometimes in the evenings and tried to find patterns. The blazes were distributed across all 5 patrol routes, but clustered in the eastern and southern sections. The cairns appeared and disappeared without consistency. The chair, now chairs, moved in a roughly circular pattern through the sector, though the intervals between sightings varied. The hum was loudest in the old growth area and quietest in the north. None of this added up to anything. The data points were scattered and disconnected, like stars before someone draws the constellation lines. Or maybe there were no constellation lines. Maybe it was just randomness, and I was the one trying to impose order on it, the way a lonely brain does when it has too much time and too little input. On day 78, I decided to do something I hadn't done before. I decided to go back to a location where I'd previously found an anomaly and wait. The Southern Creek crossing, where I'd last seen the 2 chairs. I would go there, and I would sit, and I would watch, and I would see if anything happened. I'm not sure what I expected. Part of me expected nothing. Part of me expected to sit in the rain for 6 hours and come home cold and wet and feeling foolish. But a smaller, quieter part of me expected to see whoever was doing this, to catch them in the act, to finally have something concrete, not a mark on a tree or a stack of stones or a piece of furniture in the wrong place, but a person, a face, an explanation. I reached the creek crossing at 0900. The chairs were gone. Both of them. The creek ran clear and unhurried over its bed of smooth stones, and the space where the chairs had been was just forest floor, fern and moss and duff, with no impression, no mark, nothing to indicate that anything had ever been there. I searched the immediate area. I walked in expanding circles, pushing through underbrush, checking behind logs and under overhanging banks. No chairs. No sign of chairs. I spent 2 hours looking and found nothing. At 1100, I sat down on the flat rock by the creek, the same rock one of the chairs had been placed on, and I ate a granola bar and drank water from my bottle, and I listened to the hum, which was strong here, and the creek, which was constant, and the drip of the canopy, which was steady. And I realized that I was not going to find anything because there was nothing to find. Not because the anomalies weren't real, but because whatever system was producing them operated on a logic I wasn't equipped to understand. And all my searching and documenting and pattern seeking was just another form of tail chasing, exactly what Ellison had warned me against. I felt a wave of something that might have been despair, or might have been relief. The two feelings are closer than people think. I went back to the station. Around this time, I noticed something about the cabin that I want to describe because it illustrates the kind of slow, insidious doubt I was living with. I had been in the station for almost 3 months, and I knew the interior intimately. I knew which floorboard creaked near the door, which shelf was slightly crooked, where the draft came through on windy nights. It was my space, as familiar as my own body. And yet, I started noticing small things that seemed different. A can of beans on the shelf that I didn't remember being there. The desk chair positioned at a slightly different angle than I'd left it. A pencil that had been on the desk now, in the cup by the radio. Tiny things. Meaningless things if you were in a normal state of mind, but I was not in a normal state of mind. I was in a state where I had been primed by months of small anomalies to notice everything and trust nothing, and so each tiny discrepancy felt like evidence. Even though I absolutely knew, that I was probably responsible for all of it. I moved things without thinking. Everyone does. You put a pencil down, and 5 minutes later, you don't remember where you put it. That's normal. That's human. But the doubt was there. The question, did I move that, or did someone else? And the question once asked was impossible to answer, because the evidence was always insufficient, always ambiguous, always exactly balanced between the two explanations, which meant I could never resolve it, which meant it stayed in my mind, accumulating, joining the collection of unresolvable things that was growing heavier and heavier. I started placing objects in specific positions before leaving the cabin. I'd put the pencil at a 45-degree angle across the notebook, point toward the north wall. I'd align the can labels facing forward. I'd push the desk chair in until it touched the desk. When I came back from patrols, I'd check. The objects were always in the right positions. Nothing had moved. This should have been reassuring. And it was, briefly, until I realized that it proved nothing, because whoever was moving things, if anyone was moving things, could simply have been watching and replaced everything exactly as it was. Or, more likely, nothing had ever been moved, and I was performing rituals to ward off a threat that existed only in my deteriorating perception. I stopped the rituals after a week. They were making me worse. Day 85. I was on the Western Patrol, a route I'd walked many times, and I came to a section where the trail passed between two large boulders, a narrow gap that I had to turn sideways to pass through. I squeezed between the boulders and came out the other side, and the trail continued as expected, downhill, through a stand of young fir. But something was wrong. The trail ahead of me was not the trail I remembered. The contour was different. The trees were the same species but in different positions. There was a stump on the left side of the trail that I'd never seen before. Cut clean, old, mossy, but definitely a stump. Definitely the remains of a felled tree. And I had walked this trail a dozen times, and there had never been a stump there. I stopped and looked behind me. The boulders were there, the gap I'd just come through. I looked ahead. The trail continued, implausible, real, but wrong. I checked my GPS. The coordinates placed me exactly where I should be, on the western route, at the expected point on the trail. The GPS said I was where I was supposed to be. My eyes said I was somewhere I'd never been. I stood there for several minutes, trying to reconcile the two inputs. Then I continued walking. Because what else was I going to do? Turn around? Go back through the boulders and pretend the trail on the other side was correct when I couldn't be sure any trail was correct anymore? The route completed normally. The sampling points were where the GPS said they'd be. The terrain evened out into familiar patterns. By the time I reached the station, I'd almost convinced myself that I'd simply been disoriented by the boulder gap, that passing through a narrow space can trick the vestibular system, that everything was fine. Almost. That night, I pulled out the trail map and studied it. The western route was clearly marked. There was no indication of a stump, but then trail maps don't show individual stumps. There was no reason to believe the trail had changed. There was also no reason to believe my memory was faulty, but I'd been given plenty of reasons to doubt my memory over the past few months. And so, I was left, once again, in the exact space the instruction had carved out for me, uncertain, unable to resolve, unwilling to report. I thought about calling Ellison. His number was in the manual, listed under Sector Supervisor, Non-Emergency Contact. I picked up the satellite phone twice and put it down twice. What would I say? The trail looked different? There's a stump I don't remember? He would tell me what he'd already told me. He would tell me I was chasing my own tail, and he would be right, or he would be wrong, and I would have no way of knowing which. I didn't call. Weeks 12 and 13 are harder to describe because my sense of narrative sequence was breaking down. I know what happened. I have the field notebook. But the events don't arrange themselves into a clean timeline the way earlier events do. They cluster. They overlap. Some things I wrote down multiple times without realizing it. And when I read the notebook now, I find the same observation recorded on 2 different dates in slightly different words, as if I had experienced it twice or forgotten that I'd already experienced it. Here is what I know happened during those 2 weeks, in no particular order. The hum stopped. After weeks of constant presence, it simply ceased, and the silence it left behind was more disturbing than the sound had been. The forest without the hum felt hollow, like a room someone had just left. I kept listening for it, straining to hear it, and sometimes I thought I caught it. Just a trace, like the after-image of a bright light, but I could never be sure. I found a third chair. It was in the clearing around the station, about 60 feet from the cabin, at the very edge of the tree line. It was facing the cabin, facing my window. It was there in the morning when I woke up, and it was gone by the time I came back from my patrol. I found it once more, 2 days later, in the same position. Same chair, or one identical to it, same angle, same orientation, facing the window, facing me. The blazes on the trees began to multiply. Where there had been 1 per tree, there were now 2 or 3, at different heights and orientations. Some trees had horizontal marks, some vertical, some diagonal. I found 1 tree with 7 blazes arranged in a vertical column, evenly spaced, from knee height to above my head. The marks were all fresh. They were all clean. Central stopped asking follow-up questions during my check-ins. The exchanges became purely transactional. I reported. He said, "Copy." We signed off. No, "How are you doing?" No, "Any changes to the environment?" Just the minimum necessary communication. I told myself this was normal. I told myself it had always been this way, and I was only now noticing the absence of something that had never been present. I found my own boot print on a trail I hadn't walked in over a week. My boot, my tread pattern, my size, fresh. The mud was still wet. I had not been on that trail. I checked my notebook. I had not been on that trail. I stood there and looked at my own footprint in soil that I had not stepped on, and I felt the ground shift again. That vertigo, that slow rotation of everything I thought I knew. Day 91. I woke up, and my field notebook was on the desk, open to a page I hadn't written. The handwriting was mine. I knew my handwriting as well as I knew my own face. It was mine. The entry read, Day 91, perimeter check, 0630, all clear. Hum returned, faint, southeast, noted. It was 0615. I had not yet gotten out of bed. The day had not yet happened. And yet there, in my handwriting, was a record of events that were 15 minutes in the future. I stared at the page. I read it 3 times, 4 times. Then I got up, put on my boots, went outside, and did a perimeter check. All clear. I stood in the clearing and listened. There was a hum, faint, from the southeast. I went back inside and sat at the desk and looked at the entry in the notebook and tried to think. The simplest explanation was that I'd written it in a state of half-sleep, a hypnagogic episode, and the events had then coincidentally matched. The perimeter was always all clear. The hum came and went. A prediction of perimeter clear, hum faint was almost guaranteed to be accurate. It wasn't precognition. It was probability. But the handwriting, the specificity. Oh, 6:30. Southeast. These were details, not vague impressions. And the entry was in my notebook, in sequence, in the correct format. As if I had done the check and then written it down, in the normal order, at the normal time, but the I who had done it was not the I who was now looking at it. I closed the notebook. I put it in the desk drawer. I sat for a long time without moving. When I did my radio check-in that evening, Central asked me something new. He said, "Sector 7, confirm you are the sole occupant of the station." I said yes. He said, "Confirm no unauthorized personnel observed." I said confirmed. He said, "Copy. Maintain position." Maintain position. Not stay on task, not good work, maintain position. As if leaving were an option I might consider, as if the instruction to stay was necessary. 5 days later, on day 96, a supply drop day, I drove down to the maintenance depot and found the usual crates and one additional item, a sealed envelope, same as the operational supplements, unmarked with my name on it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It said, "Effective immediately, you are relieved of your assignment in Sector 7. Return all equipment to the station and secure the premises per standard closing procedures. Report to the regional office for debriefing within 72 hours. Do not remove any personal documentation from the sector. Do not remove any personal documentation." That meant the notebook. They wanted the notebook. The separate, unofficial record that I had been keeping because I was too disciplined to report the things I noticed, and too honest to pretend I hadn't noticed them. They knew about it. Of course they knew about it. Maybe they'd always known. Maybe the whole point of telling me not to report things was to see what I would do with the things I didn't report. Maybe the notebook was the actual data collection. Maybe I was the study. I drove back to the station. I packed my things. I secured the equipment. I did the closing checklist from the manual. I turned off the generator. I locked the door. And then I stood on the porch and looked at the tree line one last time, and I listened. The forest was quiet. No hum, no tapping, no wind. Just the deep, full, breathing silence of a living system that had been there before me and would be there after me and did not care, had never cared, whether I understood it or not. I left the notebook in the desk drawer. I don't know why. I'd spent weeks filling it, recording everything, creating a meticulous account of every anomaly, every inconsistency, every moment of doubt. It was the only evidence I had, and I left it. The instruction said to leave it, and I followed the instruction, the way I'd followed every instruction since the beginning, automatically, reflexively, as if compliance were something my body did without consulting my mind. I drove out of the sector and locked the gate behind me. I drove to the regional office. The debriefing was with a woman I'd never met. Not Ellison, not Hargrove, not anyone whose name appeared in my operational documents. She was pleasant. She asked me about my health, my sleep, my general state of mind. She asked if I'd experienced any difficulties during the posting. I said no. She asked if I'd noticed anything unusual in the sector. I said no. She nodded and made a note and thanked me for my service and said my final paycheck would be mailed. She didn't ask about the notebook. That was 14 months ago. I've been working a desk job at a different agency since then. I go home at 5. I sleep in a bed. I live in a town where there are streetlights and traffic and other people. The silence is gone, replaced by the constant comfortable noise of civilization, and I should feel better. I do feel better, in the ways that can be measured. I sleep more, I eat regularly, my hands don't shake anymore, which is something I haven't mentioned, but which had become a problem in the last few weeks at the sector. A fine tremor in my fingers that made writing difficult and that I attributed to cold and caffeine. But there are things that haven't resolved. I still check the positions of objects in my apartment before I leave for work. Pencil at 45 degrees, coffee mug handle pointing left, shoes aligned by the door. I check them when I come home. They're always in the right positions. This is not reassuring. I still listen. At night, when the apartment is quiet, I lie in bed and I listen for the hum, and sometimes I hear it, or I think I hear it. A low tonal presence beneath the ambient noise of the building, the refrigerator, the heating system, the neighbors. It's probably nothing. It's probably always been there, and I just never noticed it before the sector tuned my ears to that frequency. But I listen, and I can't stop listening, and the act of listening for something you can't be sure exists is its own kind of prison. I've tried to find records of the Sector 7 assignment. The transfer paperwork is in my personnel file, but the details are sparse. It lists the posting as remote environmental monitoring and gives a location code that doesn't correspond to any site in the agency's public database. I searched for Ellison. There's no one by that name in the regional office directory. I searched for the study, the multi-agency environmental project that was supposedly the reason for my assignment. I can't find it. I can't find any evidence that it exists or ever existed. I think about the notebook. I think about what's in it and who has it now and what they're doing with it. I think about whether my observations are being compared to the observations of the ranger before me and the one before that, and whether there's a shelf somewhere with a row of notebooks, each one filled with a different handwriting, each one documenting the same blazes, the same cairns, the same chairs, the same hum, the same slow erosion of certainty, the same quiet collapse of a mind that was told to ignore what it saw and obeyed. I think about the instruction. I think about how perfectly it worked, not by preventing me from seeing things, but by preventing me from treating what I saw as real. It didn't blind me. It did something more efficient than that. It made me blind myself. And the worst part, the part that keeps me up at night, the part that makes me check the pencil and the mug and the shoes, is that I'm still doing it. Even now, even here, even 14 months out of the forest, I catch myself setting things aside. I notice something at the edge of my perception, a sound, a shadow, a feeling of being watched, and I think, don't dwell on it. Don't chase your tail. Stay on task. The instruction is still running. It got inside me, and I can't find the off switch, and I'm not sure there is one, and I'm not sure I'd use it if there were, because using it would mean facing everything I set aside, everything I chose not to see, and the accumulation of those things over 96 days is a weight I don't think I'm strong enough to bear. So I set it aside. I don't dwell on it. I go to work and I come home and I check my objects and I listen for the hum and I write no incidents in the logbook of my own mind. And I close it and I put it in the drawer and I lie in the dark and wait for morning. Some nights, just before I fall asleep, I hear myself say something. Quietly, involuntarily, in the same voice I used on the trails when I was narrating my own actions to stay anchored. It's always the same thing. I don't know where it comes from, or what it means, or whether it's something I'm remembering, or something I'm being told. It says, don't look. It's fine. And I don't look. And maybe it is fine. And maybe it isn't. And I have no way of knowing because I was given an instruction and I followed it, and following it became who I am. And now the person I am is someone who doesn't look, who doesn't report, who doesn't ask, who sits in the dark and listens to a sound that might not be there and writes nothing down. I don't know what was in those clearings. I don't know who sat in those chairs. I don't know whose boot print I found or who blazed those trees or what the hum was, or how my own handwriting appeared in a notebook before the events it described. I don't know, and the instruction says I don't need to know, and the instruction is the only thing left that I trust, which is the most frightening thing of all. Because the instruction came from them. And I don't know who they are either.